Thanks, everybody. This will be our last opportunity to really talk about this book. It's been kind of a long haul, really. The book has been, Ancient Christianities by Paula Fredrickson has been really, I think, very insightful, but not one of our easiest books to read. She's names a lot of people, a lot of church fathers that, have been lost to the annals of history for the most part, except for uh, uh, those who work in early church history. But the one thing that's different about what Fredrickson's doing is she's bringing all of her social scientific research and archaeological knowledge and theological knowledge and historical knowledge. She's bringing all of that to bear on her assessment. In the conclusion of her book, which, obviously we'll get to today, she basically demonstrates how her methodology is quite different from that of, even the great historian of the Enlightenment, Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. She basically takes him to task. And the reason in terms of why he believes that Christianity was able to triumph, or and those are his words. And she basically takes him to task on the 5 points that he establishes. But the reason she's able to do that is because she's got a wealth of social scientific research in her pocket that Gibbon just did not have. So I say that only to mention that we are really fortunate to be on the cutting edge of research into early Christianity, and Paula Fredrickson is one of the best. Before I get started, would anybody like to, say anything or any thoughts since our last time together?
Dan,
Yeah,
Paula Frederickson's book probably is the finest finest treatise I have ever seen on, the complexity of the creation of multiple Christianities.
right.
And I'm not sure it's even close to being over today.
Oh, right, right. Uh, Especially with the scientific arm of the research, it goes into archaeology, the ability to actually do archaeology without doing any digging, which is amazing to me. Um, no, it's not over today, but the title of the book uh, really demonstrates, is really thematically focused, as any title should be, that lest we think that Christianity developed in a kind of, monolithic way, there is nothing that could be further from the truth. And the reason that the Christianity that ultimately prevailed did prevail is because of a variety of social, political, economic, cultural factors. But she's really trying to demonstrate as best she can just the complexity of the task. And it's very difficult for us to know what that early church looked like. Um, but we were the last time. Anybody else have any comments? Go ahead,
Yes,
Will.
yes. I'm sure you sent this to us, and I probably have it in my notes, but just to be safe, could you send the title author of our next book to study
Yeah,
again?
I will. In fact, I've got a slide dedicated to it
Oh,
at the very end here.
okay.
And
Thank you.
so
Thank you.
I can't remember if I did send it or not. So, but I will I'll send you an Amazon link with the caveat that I'm not expecting you to buy it from Amazon. In fact, I would prefer you did not.
Yeah.
But it's the easiest way for you to get some background, I think, on the book and see where you can possibly buy it used and things along those lines. But yes, I will send that. It's Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination. So, well, when we left off last time, we were looking at chapter 7, the last full chapter of the book itself, and looking at the the dialogue, the conversation, the interaction in Rome, especially, but elsewhere in the early Christian centuries, between the so-called pagans and the so-called Christians. And Fredrickson makes it pretty clear that this word pagan is entirely constructed, and it served the purposes of when we're talking about the fourth and fifth century, the later church, to solidify and to make unanimous the Christian belief system. The so-called pagan was eventually designated as an other, that is the other who is a danger to the church itself, the other whose beliefs are completely uh, contrary to that of the Christian faithful. But leading up to that time, by the time we get to Augustine, fourth and fifth century, time we get to Augustine, we see a lot of syncretism is the word that is often used among anthropologists, a combining of religious traditions. And it's not fair for us to think that there was a clear delineation between Orthodox Christians on the one hand and then pagans on the other. The one thing that is pretty clear, though, is that when we're talking about Orthodox Christianity, it is an urban phenomenon. And there's a reason for that. One of the reasons is that the jockeying for position that took place in the third, fourth, and fifth centuries as to what city was going to be associated with, the hub of the wheel of the Christian tradition. There were a variety of contenders, right? There was certainly Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is a place where uh, Jesus was crucified. It's the place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was already built, was built by Constantine. There was also Constantinople, which was the city that Constantine moved to from Rome in the first few decades of the fourth century. But Rome eventually took the pride of place, and that for a variety of reasons. And kind of ironically, too, because if you read the New Testament, Rome is not um, often looked at with a very favorable light. It's the Whore of Babylon in Revelation. It's the place where Peter and Paul were both martyred. But there was one thing that the Roman Catholic Church still focuses on today, and that is this idea of apostolic succession. That when Jesus tells Peter that on this rock I will build my church, and Peter, goes to Rome and that's where he's crucified, then it's seen as obvious that that should be the place where the church it has its focal point, that it is the center of the Christian world. Now, just a little aside here on that claim that apostolic succession begins with Peter. If you remember that story in the New Testament, Jesus asks his apostles, who do the people say that I am? And they have various answers. And then he asks, who do you say that I am? And Peter proclaims, you are the Christ, the Son of God. You are the Messiah. And Jesus says, well said, and on this rock I shall build my church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church has often said this rock refers to Peter because of the play on words, right? Petra meaning rock in Aramaic. Uh, and, and so Peter is the first bishop, so-called Bishop of Rome. During the 16th century, when Rome was trying, in the Counter-Reformation to proclaim its primacy, they drew upon this tradition. Look, Jesus himself said that Peter was a rock on which the church would be founded. And the reformers, Calvin, Luther, and others said, no, it's not Peter himself, but it's Peter's confession. You are the Christ. That is the rock. not the man, but the profession of Jesus as the Christ. So that is some wrangling that has taken place in the church for centuries, right? But eventually, Rome does become the center of the Christian faith, and it lives in a kind of opulence. The bishop there, Damasus, uh, gained favor with a lot of wealthy women, wealthy widows. It's the place from which the Latin Vulgate, the word Vulgate in Latin means the common translation, was issued around the end of the 5th century and the 4th century, excuse me. And then it's the place where a lot of early construction began to take place. But with that construction comes a delineation within the church. And this is where Paula Fredriksen really wants to ask some very interesting, questions. What did the church look like? We have a pretty good idea if we listen to the church fathers, and the people who are inside the buildings, right? The people who are writing from positions of power and authority. We have a pretty good idea of what they thought the church looked like. But when you want to look at the hoi polloi, right? The populace, who were they? Um, and Fredrickson makes it clear that there is a majority of people who really comprise what she calls the second church, that the majority of the people were not being associated with this organized infrastructure with bishops at the top. And in their small communities, they were practicing a form of religion that had a lot of commerce, a lot of conversations between their pagan neighbors and themselves. Um, and so we have a divided church, the elite and the masses, so to speak. And uh, Fredrickson draws on some archaeology that was done or just done very recently in eastern Syria, right along the Euphrates River. Uh, and this, of course, was under threat during the Iraq War because it was precisely at this time that this archaeological dig was going on. But it was a town there called Dura Europos. And was it was a whole town that's been excavated, and the streets have been delineated and the buildings have been identified. And if you look at like a schematic map of Dura Europos, you will see that this town featured a number of sanctuaries, a number of worship sites for pagan gods as well as for Christianity. There isn't, to my knowledge, and I don't know this very well, there isn't a main like basilica church there. This is at a time, this would have been in around 232 of the Common Era that that the church would have been that Dura Europos would have been, up and running, right? But what they found there is the image of a house church. I used to use this. There are not many schematics of this, but I used to use this in my classes at Hastings College. But this is what was unearthed at Dura Europos, and this is where most people in the church in the early centuries would have experienced Christianity in a household that was converted to, a sanctuary, a church itself. And so you have here, if you look over on the right, here's the street. You enter in and you go into this area called a courtyard. This is the place where their church would have taken place. If you can see my mouse, my cursor, this would have been a so-called Sunday school area. Think of our Lydia room, right, at First Pres, where there would have been teaching that would have gone on. And then up the stairs, can't find my cursor, up these stairs into the baptistry, and this is the baptismal font. Um, Looks like a big bathtub, but very clearly they were practicing uh, believer baptism, where they were immersing people, or at least placing them in the font and then, sprinkling water over their heads. And this is probably what the church looked like even after Constantine and the establishment of these large urban churches in places like Constantinople and Rome, but around, the Christian/Roman Empire, churches like this were pretty prominent, especially all the way into the 4th century for sure. This in Syria would have been around 230 of the Common Era. Today, this is what those ruins look like. And I think it's interesting that this wall that you see here is the outside wall of the city. This Dura Europos was a walled city. And so you had the walls, fortifications for protection. And then you had, the people in various houses on streets that that either lived there or did business there or whatever. But the fact that this house church was on the western wall, well, no, it would have been east. It would have been the northern wall. Wait, this doesn't make sense to me now. Yeah. I can't remember. I'm trying to think of the map in my head, but it was on one of the walls of the city. Now, if you know anything about the story of Joshua in Joshua fighting the battle at Jericho, the people who lived in walled fortifications, the people on the outside of the city, on where the walls were where the most danger was in the time of attack. That was the low rent district, right? So even the placement of this church, this house church, suggests that it is not exactly a church populated by the elite of the town. It's in, let's call it, the low rent district, but it gives us a sense of what it may have looked like in the 3rd century. So what are your comments or thoughts about that, or questions?
Dan, I was just thinking about a presentation that Bill Nottage Tacey gave us about some of the same kinds of home churches, and that one was very close to Nazareth. So apparently they were in lots of different places and may represent what you're talking about with the different communities apart from Rome, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
And they were obviously, using art. You can't see this, but there is, human representations of Jesus on the walls here. Now, interestingly enough, in the early church, the artistic representations do not feature the cross, do not feature the crucifixion. It's more of the Jesus, the Good Shepherd, the Hermes character with the sheep over his shoulders. So that's where that's also very intriguing itself. But this is where early, what you might call primitive, or early primitive Christian art was also practiced as well. So, well, any other thoughts about this? Folks, I just realized that I did not bring my phone in with me, so I don't know what time it is. So if you give me just a minute to find that, I'll be right back.
Denny and Will, did you go to any places like that when you were in the Holy Land where they were doing archaeological finds or digs?
I think, well, only down around Jericho. There were at least displays or facsimiles of what they had discovered in those glass cases as we were going into lunch.
Yeah, that's good, Denny. But there was also some excavation up north on the north side of the Sea of Galilee.
Well, folks, I can't find my my phone, so you're going to have to clue me in on where we are. Um, Thank you for allowing the interruption there. I find this fascinating. We talked about it a little bit before we left last time. Uh, Fredrickson says, so, if people weren't spending time early on in these large basilica type churches, that you find in Rome and elsewhere, um, then what were they doing? And she makes the argument that most of them were worshiping outside, and not simply outside, but at cemeteries, which really draws on the pagan idea that's been around since time immemorial, and that is the cult of the dead. The early religious worship that we know of is ancestor worship, and there's something very primal about the idea that our ancestors deserve our respect, our acknowledgement, some cases our nourishment, in most cases need to be fed as an homage to their memory. And this was obviously practiced by pagans in, the Roman Empire. And Christians considered it a matter of course that, well, this is where we can do our worship as well. And so you have this, uh, what Fredrickson refers to as convivia, this conviviality of people, intermixing. Pagans would do things, various rituals, they would have dances. And by the way, this is where the if you know about the Christian tradition, we don't have a very strong dance tradition in Christianity. Interestingly, there is some indication that among the religious of the Middle Ages, there were ballets or dance concerts that were being developed, but dance has always been looked askance at. It's always been suspected of devilry or whatever. Well, this goes back to those rituals that would take place in the cemeteries. A lot of dancing on the grave, so to speak, would take place as a result of these, the cult of the dead. Now, I find this uh, especially interesting for myself because, there is a tradition in Appalachian churches that I grew up with. And, when I moved to other places, I never saw it anywhere, but something about, the Scots-Irish people of Appalachia, they still retain this idea and they called it dinner on the ground. And once a year, they would meet. It would usually be about this time of year. Uh, and people they called a homecoming and a dinner on the ground. People who had left the coal fields and gone up to Detroit to work in the auto factories, they would come back and they would have a homecoming, but it would culminate uh, on a Sunday with what they called dinner on the ground, and people would bring food, and it was a potluck. But then they'd take that food into the cemetery and lay the blanket down over the graves of their ancestors and eat with the ancestors. Um, have you ever heard of anything like that in any church that you've ever been a part of? And I never really thought about it until, of course, later on studying religion. I've never found it anywhere, but there is some sort of cultural or even genetic memory that induces people to do this kind of ritual. And I think it goes back to the earliest form of religious observance, apart from maybe worship of nature, and that would be the worship of our ancestors, maintaining the memory of those who've gone before us. But you can see how this would develop into, uh, first of all, the cult of the church would take this pagan practice, the early church would take the pagan practice and turn it into an observance of the cult of the martyrs, acknowledging the martyrs, and eventually the idea of the cult of the saints, where instead of, you're worshiping your ancestors as it appeared in among the pagans, you have a continued communication with the saints who've gone before you, who can intercede for you uh, with, with God or with Jesus or with more typically Mary, right? Um, Fascinating. I did not know about this in the early church, but it makes very much sense to me. But people like Jerome, people like Augustine, uh, really tried to frown on this. They saw it as dangerous mixing, right? It's blurring the lines of the other, the pagan that we want to keep at arm's distance, right? So what do? You try to figure out a way to Christianize pagan practices that people are so firmly entrenched in, and this results in the cult of the martyrs and the cult of the saints. Fascinating idea. And of course, today we still see this. We talked about this last time, the Dia de los Muertos among Spanish-speaking cultures, especially Mexico, where it's acknowledged that you must recognize the value of your ancestors and uh, their wisdom in bringing you into the world. So, any thoughts about cemeteries in this?
Dan, I think it's interesting that um, one way of looking at things, particularly when you get to the Day of the Dead, where it's your own ancestors are honored, but then along the Catholic tradition, there is a designation of saints. It's not
Yeah,
your ancestors, but it's the holy people who've been canonized. There's this kind of switch then
yep,
to, well, here are the people you should remember first.
right, right.
Yeah.
Well, almost maybe even to the exclusion of your own personal ancestors, right? The saints become the ones who are sanctioned
Mhm.
by the church, and thus, you maintain the control, if you will. This is the kind of thing that made Marx just giggly with his critique of religion.
Well, one
Other
of the
other
reasons sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sharon.
One of the reasons I thought about that is that our neighbors at St. Cecilia, and they have a great tradition where they dress up like a saint. And the children are very much involved with these are the heroes that
Right.
should be important to you. And I think in this day and age, there might be
Indoctrination, maybe.
a saying, kind of here are the heroes that matter most, not the
Yeah,
ones you see in the cartoons. And I think I see that being reiterated.
yeah. The superheroes, right? I know what you're talking about because, the saints all have their amulets. Again, amulets which have been connected with pagan worship. So uh, these concrete manifestations of the power of the person that they represent. They collect these amulets, these little, saint medallions. And I had a friend who was just a rabid atheist, but she was coming came from a Catholic family, and her nieces and nephews were all about the very thing that you're talking about, Sharon. They were uh, lionizing the superheroes. They're superheroes, right? They're, Saint Anthony, and who do you pray for this, and who do you pray to for that? Um, but it was a way to circle the wagons, right, so to speak, if you will. Denny, did I see that you wanted to say something?
Oh, I think, let me rephrase. I wonder how many, current day, Protestant churches, acknowledge, All Souls Day.
Yeah, right. Um, and it's become more and more difficult these days because Halloween has become such a $1 billion a year industry, right? We're, uh, but sure, All Souls Day, the Protestants saw that as smacking of kind of paganism as well. I mean, the Protestant reformers, uh, um, I mean, I should say the ritualization of it in the Catholic Church. We certainly recognize All Souls Day. Uh, but have you noticed that it also happens to fall right on the heels of Reformation Sunday, right? So we we've kind of even tried to replace All Souls with Reformation Sunday. They're so closely aligned with each other. Um, anyway, I want to move on. I don't want to keep us from our conclusion here. Um, Fredrickson comes up with this number, and it's a guesstimate, she says. But she's talking about, well, when we look at, the churches and, the people in the cemeteries, what kind of percentages are we talking about? And her best guess, based upon historical evidence, historical research, is about 5% of the elite were worshiping in, the basilicas and the Romanesque churches, whereas 95% of the people were, out in the cemeteries. And this is her quote: "What proportion of total community of those who identified as Christian did this group within the walls, that is the church, represent? One historian has guesstimated, perhaps 5%. But their spirituality could overlap with the far greater number, the 95%, question mark, who in effect constituted a second church. These people congregated mostly out of doors, their venues of choice around the tombs of and memorials to the special dead. This means that the cult of the saints was no curious sideline of late Roman Christianity. It probably described the way that the far greater number of Christians were churched. And what is left unsaid in that is that that is a largely pagan influenced practice, or reflects a lot of practices that were going on among the so-called pagans. So finally, the quote that is really the central quote of this book, and I just want to read it. It's on page 194. But basically, here's where she's delivering her coup de grace for the thesis of this book. And it falls right on the heels of this quote that I just gave you. But these are all the questions that have been asked, and she's going to give her answer to them right in the middle of the page. This raises the question, how do we define Christianity? Was it a religion of doctrines about how God became incarnate, about how three divine persons constitute a single deity, about how the soul after Adam manifests sin? Now, this was the abstractions of the theologians, the elite theologians. Or was it a religion of contested interpretations over how to read sacred text? Or was it a religion of realpolitik, chosen by an emperor concerned to ally himself with a powerful god to protect his empire? Constantine here. Or was it a religion of charismatic exorcisms and the defeat or domestication of demonic powers? She's going through each of our chapters, right? Or was it a religion of bishops and councils, their disputes fought out between cities whose rivalries long preceded the empire's involvement in the church? Or was it a religion of extreme fasting and self-mortification, of heroic, even extravagant asceticism? Or was it a religion of effective ritual action, amulets, spells, and incantations, no less than of sacraments? Or a religion of dancing, feasting, and celebration over graves of the charismatic dead? And then the first section of her first sentence for next section, the answer, of course, is that Christianity was all of these things. Ancient Christianities. And there is her as I like to call it, her coup de grace. She's taken us through 200 pages of evidence of just the extreme diversity of the way that people approach questions about God, questions about the body, questions about Christ, questions about how best to worship, questions about on and on and on. Uh, and she draws on what historians have said, and they like to, some of them like to say, well, there were a group of people who were really outside the fold, who were referred to as the incerti, right? They weren't very clear on what it was they believed. They thought they were Christians, but they really weren't. But she says, but these people would have told you that they're just as faithful and as devout as anybody else. They would have said, hey, look, this is what they're doing in the big church as well as, among us. And then there are the so-called semi-pagans, right? Uh, who are not, abiding by all of the creedal statements. But uh, as Fredrickson has been saying throughout this book, this word pagan is a social construct. Is it a construct that develops over the centuries that enables the church to, if I can say again, circle the wagons and define very clearly who's inside and who's outside? It did not work as well as we like to think it did because there was this fluid, movement between so-called pagan religious traditions and their practices and those of the church as well. So that brings us to our final conclusion. Any thoughts before I move on?
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Mac.
I thought it was interesting that, and I should defer to Dr. Storr on my terminologies here, but her anthropological approach to the development of the early Christian sects, that it seemed like they sort of incorporated some common sense into it when they knew that, yes, we believe in this theological tenet and that theological tenet, but also people want to go to the festivals. And they've
Right.
been going to the festivals and they're going to keep going to the festivals. And so we're not going to say don't go to the festivals. Some of them actually did say don't go to the festivals, like
Yeah.
the Killjoy Augustus. But they had to allow for that because that's just, and the reason I use the term anthropological is they just recognized human nature, that's things that we as humans are going to do and we want to do it and we
Yeah.
still do it. I mean, there's nothing particularly theological about Christmas. And in fact, in my view, it's the worst theology of the year when you start talking about Christmas. But we do it because it's fun to get the presents. It's fun to have the Christmas goose and the glug and all of that. And we're
Yeah.
not going to stop.
Hmm.
It's just part of our nature as humans.
Right.
Now, this intellectual 5% may appreciate the deeper meaning for it, but the church, which consists of the general public, they don't concern themselves with those kind of issues. And I think she's telling us that was the case 1,500 years ago.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And,
Absolutely. Go ahead, Danny.
and Mac, to add what you have just said, uh, I think most anthropologists would say it it goes beyond human nature in the sense that we are raised within a culture as tiny, tiny kids, and by the age of two, maybe three, four, five, six, we have just been immersed in, you know, Christmas and presents and festivals, and because that's what the adults do. That's what my older brothers and sisters do. And it's the norm. And if it's the norm, the churches can say whatever they want, but again, you end up with a syncretic blending or fusion, to use the Asian fusion food analogy, um, that is going to overwhelm whatever is being said, with the head of your church.
And it's not to overlook the fact that there are still efforts to do that. I remember when I was a kid, members of certain denominations couldn't go to dances and
Right.
they couldn't go to the movies, for crying out loud. So it was kind of hard to have a birthday party with these kids and have anything to do with them other than I think they would eat cake, but that's about it, you know? And
Yeah.
so we still have that, but to my experience, that always comes out a loser.
Yeah.
They
Let,
change, they change,
I mean,
they adapt.
Right.
Even the Latter-day Saints, they adapt.
Yeah.
let them eat cake.
Oh, that's good.
It makes me
Right.
think of Damon's suggestion that we need a new year. Back to our discussion over All Saints.
Yeah. Right. He proposes Advent, the beginning of the church, the church year. And it is really interesting to try to, I did this several years ago when I was part of the Benedictine Oblates, to try to live your life according to the church calendar instead of the so-called, secular Gregorian calendar. And it does give you a different perspective, but you know what? You live in the Gregorian calendar world, right? I think what Matt and Denny are saying is that, there are people who are perfectionists and purists and demand that if you're truly going to worship God, well, like the ascetics, right? Then you really have to just denounce everything about the world. But uh, there's something of the, if I can use the term, the eros that is inherent in the world, that's inherent in us, this passion for for being together, this passion for creativity, this passion for, celebration that involves the full person. Think about the your Christmas parties and things like that. Think about what the medieval calendar looked like, fit in the 14th and the 15th centuries. Just about, you think that people were working all the time, just or digging their fingers to the bone, right? But they had feast days all the time. There were feast days that were celebration days where people were eating, where meat was being. If you go to the Philippines today or Colombia, for example, or in many South American countries, Roman Catholic countries, feast days are really a part of the secular calendar, right? And we, as a predominantly Protestant nation, have not, the Reformation really wanted to do away with those saint feast days. Are usually saint days, days that commemorate a saint, and we've lost a lot. The Protestants try to squeeze out as much eros um, in the human being as possible. Um, and I'm using eros being, the Greek word for this kind of passion for life. It's where we get the term erotic love from, but I don't mean it in terms of erotic love, but just this passion that is part of who we are as the image of God. Any other thoughts?
Dan, Dan, I'm pretty convinced that a large number of people love coming to church because it is a comfortable place. It is reaffirming, it's comfortable, it's the community concept, seeing friends, thus the coffee hour.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Theology is, very secondary, I think, to most folks in the pews.
And it's so funny you say that because I was just complaining to Greg the other day that, what I do for a living and what my passion has been is about as relevant today as the work of a typewriter repair person, right? No, nobody cares about Augustine. Nobody cares about theology. You know, I would have been one of the so-called elites who were, you know, thinking about how many angels dance on the head of a pin, right? And it sometimes frustrates me that, you know, you can put a lot of work into a like a Sunday school class and people show up and ask, you know, just the most, I don't know, just don't seem like they're that interested, right? Um, but that, you know, what you're saying, Denny, is absolutely right. People don't come to church for the abstractions. I'm the only idiot that's concerned about that, right? They come to be a part of a community. And it's it's no coincidence that churches were originally built over cemeteries, over, you know, places where people were buried, because there's something of that original drive of being part of a community, this communion of saints, those who are living and those who are dead and those who have preceded us. That's really what church is about, you know. Um, so Greg had to give me a little smack down on that. So, but anyway, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I just as a matter of conclusion, you know, we've gone over a diversity of ideas about what it means to what we think the early church must have looked like. There are ideas about how to you know treat the body, the ideas about God, ideas about Jesus, ideas about how we you know properly worship, ideas about you know how much of paganism can we you know grandfather into our new if we you know when we're baptized into the church. These are all things that were happening, but Fredrickson and this is another one of her coup de grace. I don't know what the plural of that is, but you know, for a very long time, kind of the standard understanding of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire came from Edward Gibbon, and this is one of the first, you know, uh, in really insightful attempts to follow a methodology of historicism on writing about the Roman Empire. And Gibbon came up with these 5 points on why he believed Christianity was able to triumph. And it's on page 201. I'll read it very quickly. Edward Gibbon famously ventured 5 answers to why Christianity triumphed. First, he named the inflexible and intolerant zeal of early Christians, which he saw as derived from Judaism, now released from the limitations of ethnicity. Second, now think about these, okay, in light of what we've just read in the past 200 pages. Second, Christianity's doctrine of a future life. Third, the miraculous powers ascribed to the early church. Fourth, the pure and austere morals of the early Christians. And fifth, the union and discipline of the Christian Republic. Those first 4, Fredrickson has pretty much challenged and repudiated, right? There were pagans who believed in the afterlife. There were, you know, there were Christians who were flexible and tolerant, obviously, in their zeal for the faith, right? They were incorporating aspects of the world. Those first 4 things. And I wish you would have elaborated a little bit more on this. You know, it seems like kind of a quick conclusion. But the last one is the place that Fredrickson says it's a pretty good analysis of why Christianity was able to triumph. And it's because A, you had bishops in the beginning who were able to organize themselves in the urban centers. The urban centers were centers of power, and they're also centers of population, right? And were able to provide an infrastructure that later, when Constantine wanted to adopt Christianity as religion, He already had urban centers around the empire that were organized to some extent in a kind of an efficient way. And then he gives power to those bishops who then become pretty much power brokers of their own. But then it happens that the worship of Christ according to the theology of the bishops becomes the new Roman religio. Remember, we were talking about religio at the very beginning, and that is the way that the Roman emperors tried to ensure that the gods of a certain city were worshipped so that their favor would remain in the city. Well, now that becomes part of this structure. On top of that, you have this idea of Jewish apocalyptic exclusivism that, when we think about, for example, the Essenes, that there was a coming time in which there would be a reckoning, and that one had to worship a particular certain way, right? You had to worship God in this way, or otherwise you were going to be on the wrong side of the equation. Those three things mixed together, Fredrickson argues, is probably the best thing that we can draw on to explain why the church triumphed. It had nothing to do with the zeal of Christians, or, it really had to do with infrastructure. It really had to do with an efficient operation of a political group of people. So I felt that the conclusion seemed kind of rushed. I would like to have heard a little bit more about this, but given everything that we had previously read, I think it's a pretty good argument that she makes. What are your thoughts on this, Annie?
Dan, I guess I'd agree with that. And also, I have a question for you, though. This artwork on your last
Yeah.
slide, what is that? Do you know what the date for that is?
No, I don't. The reason I put it there, and I was going to explain it, is because this is the Christ Pantocrator, the creator of all, the Christ Almighty, which really represents this triumph of Christianity itself. But
Interesting that you raised this just briefly earlier, and I remember you and I talked about this maybe a couple of years ago. That one of the things that was not emphasized in the first 500 years or even longer was.
Oh, Mac. Oh. Mac, I don't know if you can hear us, but you cut out on us.
Paul's emphasis, Jesus died. You and I have both read that talk about my internet is unstable. I don't know how much of that you caught, but
we didn't get
there's a book that
anything.
you and I both read. There's a book, and I no. All right, never mind.
No. I want to hear it. I was dying to hear what you had to say.
Well, there's a book that you and I both read, and the opening lines, it's by two women scholars. I can't remember the name, and I don't have it in front of me. But the opening line is, "It took Jesus 1,000 years to die."
Right. Yeah.
And by that, what she meant, even though all of the diversity of Christianity that we've talked about, the emphasis of Christ on the cross, the crucified Christ, despite Paul's emphasis, is not there for 1,000 years.
Yeah. That's the Rita Nakashima Brock text on Paradise. I can't remember the name of it. Yes,
I have the book, and one of these days I'll read it, maybe, but
yeah, it's a doorstop. It really is. But you're right. And even in the early Christian art, we don't see in the first 3 centuries images of Jesus on the cross.
and that's why I raised it when this particular art reminded me of that fact, because unlike what if we go to the major, it's going to be the cross. all of that. But in the early days, it was a living Christ.
Right, right, exactly. And I I offered this image here because it's in the basilica in Palermo, Sicily, right over the altar. You know, in the gold plating, you might say. That's not what they call it, gold. Uh, well, anyway, um, but this is, you know, this is an original icon that was found in Sinai at this Sinai monastery, I think around the 11th century. It's called Christ Pantocrator. So this image would have definitely been after the 11th century, but it's the image theologically of Jesus as creator of all, you know, Jesus as uh, the person who validates, you know, the church in so many ways, and is validates the church and its dominion over all of creation as well. Though I don't like to look at this icon that way. Um, Anybody else have a thought about this?
Dan, where was Constantinople in, say, the fourth, fifth centuries? What was happening there, you know, that led to the creation of the Eastern Orthodox Church?
Well, they were far more theological, but in a way that was more mystically oriented, you know. Um, yeah, it's hard to. The easy answer is the Byzantine theology, which is a very Greek philosophical approach to understanding who Christ is, and the idea of theosis, which means that people can aspire to divinization, if you can use that word, becoming one with God, a very mystical type of theology that was very focused pretty much on, you know, this elite idea of the worship of God in the church. Um, but it was less of what's called a voluntarist tradition, you know, that focuses on action, and more of a tradition that focuses on contemplation. And that's still the case today. And that's a very, very brief overview of the difference. At some point, we should look at Greek Orthodox theology. Um, but of course, the Byzantine Empire is going to, you know, develop on its own over against, not against, but in conjunction with the Western Catholic tradition until the fall of Constantinople. So, as we move to the future, our next book is going to be, it's called The Prophetic Imagination. In fact, this is the wrong book. I took the wrong picture. So, Will, don't write down the practice of prophetic imagination. This is what Walter Brueggemann has known about prophetic imagination. You will see it associated with his name forever. But in 1985, he wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination, talking about the role that the prophets play, really a pivotal role that the prophets play in the development of the Hebrew Bible. And so this is not the book. I will send you a link to the book. I guess I wasn't thinking well enough when I did that. But here's Walter Brueggemann on the left, a Nebraskan. I don't know much about his time in Nebraska, but he is famous and infamous for his teaching, taught at Columbia Theological Seminary. People who knew him knew that you did not sit in the front row when he spoke because you would be spit on because he was so enthusiastic about what he did. But really, I mean, as you would expect from a Nebraskan, a really approachable guy. Uh, and you can't help but like him despite the fact that he was almost overly enthusiastic about his topic. Um, but he's no longer with us. He recently died, and you know, the world lost one of its great Hebrew Bible scholars. So the name of the book is The Prophetic Imagination. And this book that I'm showing you here is another text on how to put that into practice through your preaching. So, but the prophetic imagination is what he is known for and really has provided a paradigm for helping people in the Protestant churches, at least, understand who the prophets were and um, what their vocation really was. So there we have it. And I'd like to ask, next week, I have a commitment at the Cather Center down in Red Cloud and will not be able to make our meeting. So it's probably a good time for us to, just take a week, take a break, and then start again in 2 weeks. Does anybody have an objection to that? You can start reading. And I think you'll find that Brueggemann's book is a lot easier to read than Fredrickson. I'm sorry to put you through the slog of this this book, but I had fun. So
Dan,
yeah, go ahead.
I hope I speak for all of us that you may think you're a cipher, but we are delighted you're here to bring us up to increasing levels of speed on theology. And where else, you're a delight, and where else are we going to find this, in such a community?
Yeah,
Indeed.
I agree, and I appreciate it very much. But again, it's just like this is the percentage of people who would be interested in this Electrics typewriter in 2025.
We'll still be interested in you.
Okay. All right, folks. Well, thank you. I appreciate, and we'll end on that. And I'll see you in 2 weeks, and I'll send that link out. In fact, I'll do it right now, just so I don't forget. Okay. See you
Thanks so
later.
much.
Thank you then.
Bye.